Thank you. I'm incredibly delighted to be with you here today among kindred spirits. I mean, it's just so great to be among people who are passionate about the issues that I care so much about. I appreciate that this is a final talk before lunch awaits. I may have to go a little quicker than I planned, but I hope you will enjoy kind of learning a little bit more about what some other farmers in other parts of the world are doing to build our planet's resilience. We've just moved into the International Year of Pulses. So all you bean and lentil and pea and chickpea aficionados out there must be super excited. But we also concluded the International Year of Soils. And I don't know about you, but I think that it was really high time for that underrated actor in the food system to step into the spotlight. USC Canada, like most of you here today, champions the first link in the food chain, seeds. Those tiny packets of enormous potential that, if sufficient, diverse, and adapted, keep the human beings on this planet well fed. So we've labeled our global program Seeds of Survival. But when you think about it some more, it's the soils with their armies of microorganisms and nutrients just below the surface that bring those little packets of food potential to life. So maybe we should call the lovely deep brown earth that gets under our nails every spring the first link in the food chain. But then again, there's the sun and the water that drops from the skies and melts from our glaciers to run deep beneath those soils. And what about the expert hands of the farmers that plant those seeds, harvest that water, and nurture those soils? Truth be told, it's their intimate dance that makes the system work on our behalf, that interdependent web of all existence of which we are all a part. And if we're going to handle the increasingly unpredictable climate and extreme weather events, we had better pay very careful attention to the entire interconnected food production system, and more particularly to the human experts in that wonderful dance, the small-scale family farmer who actually feed the majority, the overwhelming majority of us on this planet. It's not the industrial food system. And that is essentially what the concept of resilience is all about. The way everything is interconnected, an amazingly highly complex system with each part needing to be respected, each part needing to be nurtured, but most importantly, each part needing each other. And family farmers who farm with what Mother Nature has to offer know this truth only too well. And I only wish more policymakers understood how resilience really works. I first started to think about resilience 18-ish years ago when I took a graduate course on sustainable development from an ecologist, Vickert Burkus from the University of Manitoba. And for sustainable development, Dr. Burkus argued, resilience thinking is a must. Resilience theory has therefore proved to be central to my studies with Indigenous farmers in the Bolivian Andes, and has since become central to the work of my organization, USC Canada, and the Bout of Family Initiative on Canadian seed security, which is part of our work. I especially like the way the concept is a hopeful alternative to the pejorative concept of poverty. With resilience thinking, you don't start by looking at what's missing, the deficit, the hole that needs to be filled, but you start to look at what is really there. And there is plenty of resilience to discover if we look carefully enough. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time, I'll go fairly quickly over the theory, the resilience theory that did influence some of my thinking when working with farmers. But it really was the Indigenous farmers I studied alongside in the year 2000 who taught me about what resilience is, and more importantly, about some of the do's and don'ts if we want to strengthen resilience. So this quote to begin, all effects we observe in the world of experience are interrelated in the most constant manner and merge into one another. From the first to the last, they form a series of undulations. These were the words of a philosopher, scientist, poet, and I would add pioneer ecologist. Any guesses? Goethe challenged his fellow citizens to consider nature and humanity's role within it as a dynamic and interconnected and ever-changing web of activity. So that Cartesian hurry to order and compartmentalize nature's parts clearly had its critics early on. Resilience theory is rooted in a very well-established history of systems thinking and complexity theory. One of the earliest definitions of resilience came from an ecologist, C.S., or commonly known as Buzz Halling, in the early 1970s. He suggested it's the ability of a system to adapt to change and disturbance while still remaining within a critical threshold. And that's really the key. There must be built-in options and enough redundancy or fat in the system to better respond to stressors. So it's correctly associated with diversity. Inter and intra-species diversity, for example, enhance an ecosystem's capacity to withstand shocks and surprises, and if damaged, to rebuild itself. Disturbances within the system, of course, are not only generated through naturally occurring events like forest fires and insect outbreaks, etc., but also from human contributions like pollution or overfishing. And that's where this concept of that ecologists called socio-ecological resilience or community resilience essentially enters the picture. A natural system's responses to resource use and the reciprocal response of people to changes in natural ecosystems constitute these dynamic, nested systems that exhibit adaptive behavior. The emphasis here is on the notion of social cohesion and a society's ability to innovate. Resilience isn't just about rolling with the punches or bouncing back from shocks, as it's often defined. It's also about the capacity to learn and the capacity to innovate in order to adapt. So when one path, one approach, one opportunity is blocked, you need new and creative ideas about moving forward. And if you do get to that critical threshold and there no longer appears to be options, then a flip occurs, which shifts the system into a state that's less desirable, often irreversible, and unrecognizable. Social systems have critical thresholds too, those tipping points, when even the smallest of disturbances, that proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, can send a social system over the brink and into a new reality. And I think one of our clearest examples of a human-induced flip is the loss of the cod fishery in the North Atlantic seaboard, because not only did the fishing industry collapse, villages were emptied, and even the survival of the cod itself is in question. And I think it's very instructive, because when a community resource like cod or vegetable, grain, or pulse crop for that matter becomes this diffuse global commodity, exploited in huge volumes in an effort to gain the competitive advantage, the idea of an uncaught fish being a lost opportunity, you ignore declining stocks until they're quite visibly threatened, and the community resource becomes an industrial commodity divorced from its place in the environment, but also divorced from its role in building a thriving, community-based, and culturally important enterprise. So the social, political, cultural context within which change takes place is central to the resilience of institutions and communities and farming communities. And so too, of course, are the knowledge systems and the worldviews that influence human interaction with the environment. Some of you may be familiar with Princeton ecologist Simon Levin. He developed in the early 2000s a list of commandments for the management of complex environmental systems. And to guide my research with indigenous potato farmers in the Bolivian highlands, and more specifically to help me assess the resilience of my research communities, I borrowed from those commandments to develop a kind of community resilience lens with 9 interconnected characteristics, which Michaela was talking about. And the idea is that resilience is not a state arrived at, but a dynamic set of conditions, and therefore the circles. I don't have the time right now to go through each of these, but when you turn each of these characteristics into a question, you can begin to understand the capacity to change without compromising one's identity and integrity. For example, is the community acting in ways that reduce uncertainty and risk, carefully reading and monitoring internal and external forces that can affect its status? Or is the community designed in such a way that component parts have some independence? Sustaining modularity within a system, sort of the idea of independent components that are interlinked but can be disconnected if needed, is really a critical element in a resilient system. So modular structures, for example, can better provide a buffer against cascades of disaster, and community institutions, if we use that analogy, also have a chance of survival if they are multifaceted and not so centralized. I just want to mention one more aspect of that's here, that the literature on resilience, and particularly within the ecological movement, is not directly addressed, and that is the question of power. Is the community willing to address issues of control and ownership and share knowledge? Asking who counts and who benefits is crucial. So enough on theory. Let's leave North America now so I can share with you a bridge story about my Bolivian experience with Indigenous farmers called Palca in the year 2000. I will be doing a workshop this afternoon at 4 o'clock, and so if you're interested in hearing a little bit more detail, please join me. At that point, I'd already worked in the field of international development for about 15 years. And when I headed to their highlands, but it really was farmers like Don Pedro who really taught me about the importance of really first looking carefully at the knowledge, the natural resource assets, and the resilience that's already on the farm if we really want to keep people on landscapes with constant climate challenges. And believe me, those challenges are ever present in the Andean highlands. So just close your eyes for a moment and think about the Andean highlands. They're an imposing, at times merciless range filled with archback ridges, sculpted rock faces, bright patches of adobe, green, purple, red, and gold at harvest, and ribbon-thin roads that lead to their villages. Their beauty can really take your breath away, and the altitude, too, for that matter. But their splendor reaches beyond a commanding appearance. The Indigenous residents here can lay claim to one of the world's greatest shares of cultivated plants, and more particularly to the center of origin and diversity for our beloved potato, the world's 4th to 8th most important food crop, depending on who's counting. So what a privilege it was for me to hike into research communities like this one, and to study with these incredibly hardworking Halka farmers from Mahone with equipment like this, and on slopes like these, they were growing this kind of potato diversity. Those are 69 pairs of different varieties of potatoes. But for a host of very complex reasons, they weren't doing particularly well when I spent time with them. And part of the problem, the paradox I discovered, was that the development assistance they were receiving was steadily eroding the inherent strengths of their local farming system. Development institutions and NGOs from both the political left and the right had failed to varying degrees to take their differing worldviews and knowledge systems seriously. And most importantly, they ignored a centuries-old resilient strategy called ecological complementarity. It sounds like a fancy word, but it was core to their land management and food production systems. Some of you may know of it. It's often referred to as doble domicilio, vertical farming, dual homesteading. And farmers produce food at different levels, different altitudes, growing several root and bean and certain cereal crops in the highlands, and corn, wheat, and fruit crops in the valleys. And this multiplicity of land spread between highland and valley ecosystems, generally within a few days' hike, served both as an adaptation to high levels of climatic risk and more secure methods of generating income. And there are several other dynamic and complementary components with this system that are really linked to their strong sense of who they are, of their landscape, and of their responsibilities to each other. Given time constraints, though, let me simply highlight how this multifaceted ecological complementarity was and continues to be a resilience strategy par excellence, as the next slide suggests. So what I did is I kind of developed that resilience lens to look on the outside loop at the characteristics of resilience that I showed you earlier, and then some of the characteristics of their system. And it really was amazing at just how resilient the system had once been, but of course was being undermined by external forces. Because most of the development institutions workers I met considered it a nuisance, old-fashioned, that these farmers would go for months at a time to these other landscapes, and it disrupted their training programs. So the producers were encouraged to stay put, intensify production, and adopt the Green Revolution potatoes bred with a focus that was almost exclusively on yield. It didn't seem to matter terribly that these introduced spuds would require a costly dose of fertilizer, pesticides, and insecticides to grow well on those semi-arid highland landscapes, nor was their plasticity or their stability considered. The extra time and fuel needed to cook those big fat Dutch potatoes wasn't factored in, or the fact that the water content of the new potatoes was much higher, with protein, antioxidant, and minerals levels significantly lower. Because compared to the pot-marked, odd-shaped local varieties, these foreign interlopers were handsome, with few blemishes. They could do well in markets seeking uniform quality control and shapes that fed easily into French fry machines. Fortunately, at least half the families in my study continued with dual homesteading, and almost all resisted a complete abandonment of their local tubers. They held on to at least a handful of their favorite, tastier, and more nutritious varieties, but the commercial potential to grow the faster growing and higher yielding new potatoes was too attractive to pass up. So commercial potato monoculture took hold with a vengeance, with disastrous results. In the year 2000, the average farm family income in the community that I studied, the one that had the longest 20-year history of outside development funding, was approximately $300 Canadian a year. So it would be a mistake to point only an accusing finger at the development community alone, but the blind eye to the sophisticated resilient systems that had been in place meant that the assistance offered neither curbed the most repeated complaint among farm families in the region, which was land deterioration and, surprise, surprise, soil infertility. And the biodiversity that remained within these communities was actually maintained in spite of, not because of outsiders sent to help. It was not, I concluded, what the smallholder farmers lacked that merited a helping hand, but what they already had, highly threatened with sophisticated ecosystem management and resilience strategies. Thankfully, the model imposed on these farmers is being challenged with impressive results. You are challenging these kinds of models with impressive results. And there are more and more studies, more and more evidence that looks at even the higher yields, as you know, that organic and agroecological systems have. One in Africa involving 17 countries by Preddy in 2004 found that the yields had increased between 50 and 100%. They aren't successful, of course, these practices, because they don't just use toxic chemicals. They work because they consider the interconnected web, not the least of which is the critical stewardship of farmers who read their landscapes like an editor reads a promising novel. If the potato producers whose fields you see in this slide had planted only the potatoes from the area's research station, guess which ones they were, and not their own frost-resistant varieties, these families would have been out of luck and very hungry. Of course, as we all know, and we heard Kiki talk about external pushes to adopt Western technologies, and also in the GMO session before here. So-called climate-smart agriculture are ever present and ever strong. And my Bolivia story is not at all dated, unfortunately. Big aid dollars continue to be targeted for expensive Western-style training and technologies. But that's a story I think that you're all quite well aware of. And the one thing, though, that I do want to point out before closing is that what is forgotten in that so-called climate-smart strategizing is the fact that it's been the peasant or family farmer that has shown the most innovation over time. Over 40 years, formal sector plant breeders have released about 8,000 new crop varieties, very impressive, although many of them are ornamental plants. By contrast, however, small farmers have bred and contributed more than 1.9 million plant varieties to the collections in national gene banks around the world. Woo! So if we're truly interested in climate resilient strategies, we have to start with what we already have, an incredibly rich body of knowledge about producing on landscapes where the natural system usually has the upper hand. And there is momentum on our side. What was that first number that you had at the first conference? 60 some odd people, and now 1,000 people are participating in this event, either here or online. Our emergent seed and food movement is growing in leaps and bounds, gathering women and men from different classes, from different regions, from different races, backgrounds, from both rural and urban landscapes. Lots of food being grown in our cities. And from the global south and the north, we're all learning from each other. And while we're a little late to the dinner table, please excuse that pun, but I live with a punster. Like you, we Canadians now have our own organic or ecologically grown Made in Canada seed program. The About a Family initiative on Canadian seed security, and with all of those here involved in that program, stand up so you can be asked about it some more. Woo! So I am really looking forward to learning more about all of the wonderful work that you folks are all doing here in the next couple of days. Do you recognize this crop? Come on, I know there are breeders here that know this crop really well. Barley. How many of you drink beer? Be honest. Well, it was Ethiopian barley that actually is allowing us to continue to drink beer, because there was a major rust in the mid-70s that threatened the North American barley crop, and of course, consequently, our beer industry, and it was a gene from an Ethiopian variety that saved the day. So when we celebrate this wonderful work we're doing together with a few beers possibly this evening, let's remember to toast our Ethiopian friends. The production and celebration of food from seed to spoon and soil to plate draws an incredible cross-section of people from all across our planet, starting with highly innovative, small-scale seed and food producers. A big round for them right now, for you. Thoughtful activists, yay the activists. Amazing breeders, yay the breeders. Researchers, consumers, we're all consumers. And institutions that are increasingly want to source local and organic food. And I think that this multi-layered, collaborative food movement is probably our most hopeful attempt to rebuild our planet's resilience, as well as the well-being of its humans, of other species, and natural resources we once had in abundance. In the words of author Arundhati Roy, Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you.